The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com.
Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. You might be familiar with the novels of Edith Wharton, but you probably don't think of her as a playwright. I certainly didn't until I heard about a play of hers in the special collections of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Austin. Today we're joined by Dr. Laura Rattray, who's a reader in American literature at the University of Glasgow, and Dr. Mary Chinery, who's a professor of English at Georgian Court University in Lakewood, New Jersey. Together, they brought the manuscript of Wharton's play, entitled The Shadow of a Doubt, back into the public consciousness. Laura and Mary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Can you tell us more about Wharton's career as a playwright? How did she relate to the theatrical environment of the time?
It's a great question, isn't it, Mary? And you're right, of course, Mike, when we think of Edith Wharton, we don't think of the plays, we don't think of the theatre. We think of novels like The Age of Innocence, with which she became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. We think of The Custom of the Country, The House of Mirth, that high school staple, Ethan Frome. Although often important scenes in her novels are set in the theatre. But the fact is, as both Mary and I would agree, that Wharton was also a playwright, and we don't talk about it. Any reference to her theatre work begins and ends usually with a brief reference to her adaptation of The House of Mirth with Clyde Fitch. And Wharton herself didn't help us here because she downplayed the theatre in her published memoir, A Backward Glance, probably because it was a field in which she didn't enjoy great success. But throughout her life, she was interested in playwriting, writing original plays, adapting plays, writing translations for plays. And I think it's those original plays that are of the most interest. So at the turn of the century, before she publishes a novel, Wharton was working really hard at playwriting, and playwriting was more important to her, we think, than establishing herself as a novelist. And we know there are a number of unfinished, unpublished plays in the Beinecke Library at Yale. For example, The Man of Genius, a social comedy set in high society England. It's a comedy of errors, misunderstandings, where all, in the end, is happily resolved, which is very unlike Wharton, of course. Then there's a dark, untitled play, which begins in high society with two gossiping society ladies, where a society lady is pregnant, not by her husband, and things have to be covered up. And then the said ladies discover that their unmarried maid is also pregnant, and then down reigns hypocrisy, condemnation, double standards. And we know there's a play called The Tightrope, which seems now to be lost, though I know Mary and I, we're hopeful, aren't we, Mary, that it is out there somewhere. And we know a little of that from letters, again suggesting a social comedy with a big set scene of balls, a character called Mrs. Smash, which seems to have great comic potential. And yet none of the plays quite made it to professional production. And The Shadow of a Doubt, which is catalogued in the Harry Ransom Center, dates from that period. It was in production by 1901, so this seems to be a different kettle of fish, really. Do you say that in the States? A different matter. But in the end, that too didn't quite make it to professional production, and that was cancelled.
You know, I noticed in reading the script, there are a couple of these kind of meta-theatrical references, these moments where I think one character says, hey, look, I'm not a melodrama villain. You know, I'm not that kind of person you're going to see on the stage. I'm a real character.
Yes, she doesn't. She sets up what seem to be these melodramatic stereotypes and then in many ways undercuts them, I'd suggest. Would you agree, Mary?
Absolutely. She is creating a wonderful dramatic environment, very, very witty. I think, as you say, very mindful of the genre in which she's working. She was by no means a novice, I think, in playwriting. And was really, I think, as Laura said, trying to set herself up in the world of theater as a legitimate playwright. And I think she did that because it was something she really enjoyed doing. And she talked a lot about how much fun playwriting was. Even though it was a lot of work, it was a great deal of fun. And she was very well connected, we found, in the theater world. She had a theatrical agent, Elizabeth Marbury, and had her work performed with Charles Frohman, who was the great leading impresario of the day. A lot of them were shorter works. She did have short works like The Twilight of the God and Copy performed in like theater groups, student theater groups on Broadway that Charles Frohman had established. But she had a lot of other connections that I think we're still going to see being unpieced. She worked with C.B. Dillingham, who was Julia Marlowe's agent on Mannion Lescaut. So we're still unpiecing all of those connections that we had, but we're finding that she had many more connections to the professional world of theater than we thought. And as Laura said, she really was trying to establish herself as a playwright who was taken seriously for her theater, and she almost got there. That's the funny part. She had several things lined up to be performed, but for whatever reason they were canceled.
Can we talk about the play itself? What is Shadow of a Doubt about?
Well, it's a deceptive play. It starts off set in England, as many of her early plays are. It's a high society setting, the world of earls and right honourables and landed gentry. A lot of great Wharton one-liners. Nobody does a one-liner like Edith Wharton. And you think, oh, here we go, nice piece of fluff, beautifully done. And then it takes quite a dark turn. We open up Kate and John, recently married. Kate was the nurse to John's first husband, who had been very seriously injured in an accident, and the stepdaughter adores Kate. Everything seems to be fine, and then there's a shift, and a plot of intrigue and blackmail unravels, and we learn that Kate, as the nurse, had actually helped her predecessor to die. So it's very contemporary in that sense of, whether we call it euthanasia or assisted dying, assisted suicide. And it's presented, is it an act of compassion, or is it, as Lord Osterley, one of the central figures in a great role for a man, thinks, he comes up with this line, he calls Kate, "You venomous reptile." He thinks that she has killed his child. And the final act moves right down the social scale, and those of your listeners, Mike, who know the House of Mirth, are going to see links here. We're suddenly in a boarding house. We've suddenly got letters that are burned, and incriminating letters and blackmail, and we've really moved down to a much darker piece. Is that a fair summary, Mary?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the intrigue is really quite something, filled with one-liners, a great deal of wit, really satirizes, I think, upper-class society as well, and, talks a little bit about the hypocrisy of the upper class. Kate is, a nurse, but is she, how mindful was she? Was she the guilty party, or was she covering up the first wife's indiscretions? She also had a secret past as well. But a lot of the great effects of drama of that age, as Laura mentioned, letters and intrigues and turns of fortune are really apparent in this play. But certainly, I think great characters for women. In addition, some really great roles, and I think all of the characters are pretty well drawn.
Yeah, Laura, I'm struck by something you said a moment ago where, you kind of say it doesn't go where you expect it to. And at first it sort of looks like, oh, here's some Ibsen, here's some Pinero, here's some Shaw, a little bit of Wilde, thrown in a blender together. But from act to act, it sort of seems to change in surprising ways. I'm curious in particular about the subject matter. We talked about euthanasia, one of the things that comes up in this play. Also, maybe a little bit more conventional territory, but questions of marital infidelity. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler. What would Wharton's audience, had this play ever made it to the stage, have thought about these issues?
It's a great question, and I completely agree. We've got that mix there, and I think Mary and I both found an almost Oscar Wildean tonality about the beginning, and then that shift. Well, the play did go into production early 1901 with Charles Frohman on board, and it looked finally, as Mary says, that she was going to make it, and then it doesn't, and it's not entirely clear why. There was a piece suggesting that Frohman had suspended the play while Wharton strengthened some of the characters. But Mary and I actually wonder in our article, could it be that this subject matter was actually too controversial for a commercial audience? As you say, dealing with euthanasia in 1901. And Frohman, as a commercial producer, is looking for something that will sell, of course, but we don't know for sure.
There's a lot that you've seen sort of popular news reports about this play, about how it was quote-unquote forgotten or lost. How did you come across it?
We were at the Wharton in Washington conference together, and I was reading a paper. Laura was in the audience. The title was in my paper, but I didn't know what it was. And Laura said, "Gee, I haven't heard of that." And we started to talk about it. So that's how our conversation started, and we both started looking in archives. And I think one of the things that the reason this wasn't found is it's in a theater archive. Even though it's at the Harry Ransom, it's not in a marked Edith Wharton archives. And those really are very, very well explored. Many scholars go to visit them. And Harry Ransom is one of those very archives, and a wonderful place filled with very interesting, famous materials like the Morton Fullerton letters. But this was in a separate archive for theater. And I do think that that's a great place where Wharton scholars haven't really looked so much. And it can be an opportunity, I think, for further research for those who are interested in this topic. But that's how we came to the Harry Ransom Theater archive there. And it is well marked. I mean, that is the funny part. There it was. The archivist had very clearly marked it. And we also tell that story in the article as well, that there it was for all those years.
Absolutely. It wasn't found in an attic or a hayloft. It was listed in the catalogue. The archivists had done their job. But I think the fact Wharton scholars didn't know Wharton had written a play, Shadow of a Doubt, we didn't know to look for it. And as Mary says, the great irony is Harry Ransom, fantastic archive, is one that Wharton scholars do go to, partly because there's that cache of letters from Wharton's one-time lover, Morton Fullerton. So it's an intriguing story in that sense, and gives us hope that there's other stuff we haven't looked at that's catalogued in different archives.
I'd like to follow up on that because, as you mentioned, this was very well catalogued at the Harry Ransom Center. It seems every couple of months we get a story about, some lost play or work of literature being rediscovered. And I think for many archivists, that's a little bit frustrating because they're actually kind of hiding in plain sight. Sort of looking at it from a larger perspective, what does this say about how we sort of create theatrical and literary history?
Very good question. I think if I can address the archivist part of your question, I think we're in a new age of archival research and database research and history, because now so many things are public, they're cataloged, they're searchable. We found that the newspaper electronic archives were invaluable to what Wharton was working on. Her plays were announced in advance that they would be on Broadway, who would be starring in them, who were the producers, the directors, and we had never looked at those materials before. So I think that there's a whole group of unknown materials that scholars are delving into, and those are the archivists, the digital humanities folks, and many others. And it's not only the canon anymore. That I think similarly with the discoveries with Walt Whitman recently, an entirely new novel realized in the newspaper that scholars didn't know to look for, but this grad student, Taplin, who knew what terms to search for, and through patient exploration found it, and that's helping to kind of reconsider Walt Whitman. So too, we have the opportunity for many major writers. We just don't know everything we think we do about these so-called major writers. There's a lot more to find, I think, out there.
And Mary and I were particularly interested that this was 1901, which those who know Wharton, this is really a period where we don't have as much information as we would like. And one of the questions that we were interested in was, what does the play tell us, and what does we now learn about Wharton that we didn't know before? And I think it's been a huge help in giving us another piece of the jigsaw, rather like the great discovery of the Anna Bauman letters, recast her childhood and youth a few years ago.
We'll post a link to a number of pieces about Laura and Mary's work, including an article in The New Yorker, as well as a link to JSTOR, where for a limited time you can download and read The Shadow of a Doubt for free. Laura and Mary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Great to see you, Laura.
Good to see you, Mary.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.